Jan's research focuses on non-discrimination law and artificial intelligence, and his thesis is an analysis whether the framework of the current EU non-discrimination law guarantees sufficient protection against AI-driven discrimination. Now, he's asked me to tell you that the matter of legal requirements for training data is only located at the periphery of his research. So when I asked him to step in for Philip Hacker, we agreed that he would mainly give an overview of the current research on legal requirements for training data and not to come up with revolutionary new thoughts. But so please be kind to him. And nonetheless, I do believe that he certainly has some thoughts of his own. The floor is yours, Jan. Off you go.
So thank you for this kind introduction, and thank you to Felicia and Gaten for these practical insights. I want to start with two examples, a classic and a younger one that illustrate quite well how screw training data can lead to biased algorithmic decision-making systems. For those among you who are already afraid of being bored, don't worry. Even though I have the impression that at conferences dealing with AI bias, it is quite mandatory to mention the American recidivism algorithm COMPASS. This is not the classic example I'm referring to. I'm talking about another classic from the private sector, the Amazon recruitment algorithm. In 2014, Amazon started testing an experimental hiring tool that used artificial intelligence to give job candidates scores ranging from 1 to 5 stars. And it's pretty much like shoppers rate products on Amazon themselves. But by 2015, the company realized that its new system was not rating candidates for software developer jobs and some other technical posts in a gender neutral way. And that is because Amazon's computer models were trained by observing patterns in resumes which were submitted to the company over a 10-year period. And naturally, most of them came from men, which was a clear reflection of male dominance across tech industry at that time. In effect, so Amazon's system taught itself that male candidates were preferable over female candidates. It penalized resumes that included the words women, such as in Women's Chess Club, and it actually downgraded graduates from 2 all-women colleges as well. And eventually, the company ended the project in 2017. A more recent example is the controversial Twitter photo cropping algorithm. And I guess most of you are familiar with the recent controversy concerning this algorithm that started in 2020. And actually in May this year, Twitter announced the results of an open competition to find algorithmic bias in its photo cropping system. The company had already disabled the automatic photo cropping system in March after experiments by Twitter users last year had suggested it favored white faces over black faces. Twitter then launched an algorithmic bug bounty to try and analyze the problem more closely. And the first place entry showed that Twitter's algorithm favors faces that are, and here I quote, slim, young, of light or warm skin color and smooth skin texture with stereotypically feminine facial traits. Actually, the second and third place entries showed the system was biased also against people with white or gray hair, suggesting age discrimination, and favors English over Arabic scripts and images. So I guess any of us could name at least one way in which the algorithm would have discriminated against him or her. So we all see this is actually a real world problem, not just an academic one. So both examples show how bad training data can lead to AI-driven discrimination. In the first case, discrimination occurred because the training data reflected an unequal distribution of job opportunities in the real world. And in the second case, the training data set was supposedly not sufficiently balanced and therefore produced some unequal outcomes. But why does good or bad training data actually matter to the outcomes of artificial intelligence? For those of you who are unfamiliar with the fundamentals of machine learning, this chart illustrates the importance of AI training data quite well, and I hope the rest of you may forgive me for boring you in the minute to come and extremely oversimplifying the matter. In the most simple case of supervised learning depicted here, software designers prepare and label raw data, which is then inserted into an algorithmic model. And the model is then calibrated by matching predictions with correct results that are already contained in the training data. And afterwards, the model is tested with some test data that is held back in the training stage. And then finally, the algorithm is ready for application. So the crucial insight of this chart is what computer scientists mean with the well-known saying, garbage in, garbage out. If bad training data is being used to train the model will be biased. And therefore, the real-world application results may or will be discriminatory as well. This means that we have to consider what it actually means for AI training data to be good or bad data if we want to tackle AI bias. And in this presentation, I will start from a technological point of view and see what computer scientists consider to be good data. And in a second step, I will focus on some legal requirements and see whether law and technology match or not. One caveat at this point, as in the introduction already mentioned, my own research concerning AI-driven discrimination focuses mainly on non-discrimination law, which we will deal with in panel 2. So I'm not going to present some fundamentally new approach of my own, but I rather try to map the debate and draw attention to some questions I regard to be the most urgent. And actually, I hope I can build on some of the questions which Felicia and Gaetan asked on their last slide. So let us begin with a technological perspective on what it means for data to be good data. So there has been a comprehensive debate in the last 20 years in computer science literature about what can be labeled good data. Here depicted by a research paper by Bernd Heinrich and Matthias Clear. The metrics to measure such good data, which are most commonly discussed, comprise the following. First, accuracy, meaning the data has to be factually correct. Second, completeness, which is kind of self-explaining. Data should depict a social event in all dimensions and should comprise all relevant factors. In our Amazon example, meaning all factors that are relevant for a specific job. Apart from that, data should be consistent. It should be without any contradictions, and it should be up to date, which is also quite kind of self-explaining. Again, our Amazon example, we shouldn't train our algorithmic decision-making system with data from the 1950s due to a totally different social and economic structure of society. And in the last 10 years, some other metrics came to the forefront, apart from these mainly accuracy enhancing metrics. Among these are balance, representativeness, and factor diversity, which are set to enhance fairness in AI decision making. So balance means that data sets should equally consider data from relevant or protected groups. Representativeness is expressed in a quite similar, in a simple way, quite similar to balance, but is not restricted to protected groups. You may only think of equally consideration of data from a different socioeconomic groups. Factor diversity means that results of an algorithmic decision-making system should not be deduced from a single factor or from a small amount of dependent factors. So in computer science literature, we have some matrix to evaluate the results of AI decision-making and the training data as well. But the problem with all these matrix from a computer science perspective are at least twofold. First, all or at least most of these metrics can be only fulfilled gradually. They're not categorical. there's no yes or no, it's just rather a more or less of each category. And therefore, computer science literature is extremely dependent on external requirements, such as thresholds when an algorithmic decision-making system does actually comply with these metrics. And a good AI regulation, in my opinion, should provide such requirements, and we'll see in the second step whether current law does so. The second problem is that there exist inherent trade-offs between all of these metrics, especially between predictive accuracy and these other fairness measures, such as balance or representativeness. And actually, it's even worse than that. If we focus on the output of the model rather than on the input training data, computer science scholars even showed that it is mathematically not possible to fulfill all measurements for our metrics at the same time. For example, Alexandra Kuldakova showed in her article on the COMPASS case that one cannot fulfill or better say optimize the three criteria: false positive rate, false negative rate, and positive predictive value as some measurements for full balance at the same time. So we have these inherent trade-offs, and we have to deal with them. What does this imply? It means that we cannot consider the definition of good AI training data as a mere technological matter. It means that hard normative choices have to be made. And this leads us to the question, what the law actually has to say about good training data. So in the second part of the presentation, I want to give an overview which requirements European Union law establishes for AI training data. And I want to do this from three perspectives, or from the perspective of three legal instruments. First, from data protection law, meaning the GDPR. Second, from EU non-discrimination law, meaning the non-discrimination directives. And third, from the Commission's proposal for a regulation of artificial intelligence. Questions of tort law and contract law will be left out of the scope of this presentation for reasons of time and reasons of lack of knowledge of my own. So I want to start with an overview, which is quite pretty much leaning to a paper provided by Philip Hacker called a legal framework for AI training data, in which he compared technological metrics, some of the technological metrics just mentioned, with legal requirements of data protection law and non-discrimination law and the AI Act. And his findings are depicted on this slide. First, we see that the GDPR covers two metrics: accuracy and up-to-dateness in Article 5, paragraph 1. Factor diversity is actually not mentioned in the GDPR, but in some national data protection laws, such as the German Bundesdatenschutz Gesetz. The AI Act, on the other hand, covers accuracy, completeness, and representativeness, and probably, but I'm not quite sure about that, this would be a question of interpretation, balance in Article 10, paragraph 3 and 4. And last but not least, EU non-discrimination law could also be read in a way to establish certain requirements for AI training data. But this is a rather difficult question. I want to come to it later. So let's see what the main problems with these legal instruments are, and start with data protection law, meaning the GDPR. We have just seen that the GDPR covers the metrics accuracy and up-to-dateness in Article 5, paragraph 1, where it says personal data shall be accurate and when necessary kept up to date. But even if the GDPR contains requirements for at least two metrics for AI training data, there are some problems, and one major problem is the applicability of the GDPR in the context of machine learning. Why is that so? That is so because the GDPR is only applicable to personal data. In Article 4, it says that this is data relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. However, in the context of AI training data, this can be rather problematic in two ways, because firstly, when we train algorithmic decision-making system, we often use synthetic data, meaning these are data sets that are created artificially and mostly by simulations in data laboratories. And this kind of data, therefore, evidently does not relate to an identified or identifiable natural person. Secondly, AI training data is often anonymized in a way that the data does no more relate to an identified or identifiable natural person. So bottom line, the GDPR does contain some requirements for AI training data, but we have a huge problem with its applicability. But even if the GDPR was applicable to AI training data, I personally see two other problems, a practical and a more conceptual one. The practical problem is that the GDPR does not really specify what accuracy or up-to-dateness actually mean. And this would be a task left to the courts, and this does not only create a lot of legal uncertainty, but I also fear that judges might be quite out of the comfort zone if they were asked to further specify such technical criteria on their own, and not rely on what the legislative branch puts on the table. The second problem is more of a conceptual one. It is that the underlying rationale of the GDPR is an individual's rights approach, which we already heard by Felicia and Gaetan, whereas discriminatory results of skewed AI training data may or will affect third parties as well. I want to give an example. If the GDPR is applicable, it offers certain individuals protection from the use of their personal data. But the problem is that this could comprise with our goals of balance or representativeness, because without this data from certain persons, it is impossible for us to balance our data sets. We could solve these problems by some rather extensive interpretation of Article 6 GDPR, but I'm not so sure whether courts would do so. So eventually we have to wait until the already mentioned Article 10, paragraph 5 helps us with this problem. So we see that the legal requirements for AI training data provided by the GDPR are rather weak, and therefore let's see whether the new AI Act offers better protection. Concerning high-risk systems, the proposal establishes some requirements for AI training data, which we can find in Article 10, and we can see that AI training data has to be relevant, it has to be representative, which is further specified in paragraph 4. It has to be free of errors, which in my opinion one could easily read as some accuracy metric. It has to be complete, and software designers also have to use appropriate statistical properties, which I think could be interpreted as some kind of balance criterion. So what we see is that the AI Act actually offers some legal requirements for AI training data, but it comes with certain advantages as well as disadvantages of its own. The biggest advantage of the AI Act is that it is not restricted to personal data as the GDPR, so we will not have these severe problems with applicability. The biggest deficit of the AI Act, on the other hand, is that it too does not further specify what the criteria actually mean in mathematical terms. Philip Hacker therefore proposed in his paper to establish some safe harbors which professionals could rely to reduce legal uncertainty, which I do think would be a really good idea. But in my opinion, the AI Act suffers from another crucial disadvantage, and that is that the requirements for AI training data are restricted to so-called high-risk systems. I personally do understand the logic behind this restriction. It might be that we do not want to burden software designers with too many obligations. Just think of documentation But I am rather skeptical whether the users of so-called low-risk applications should be allowed to use irrelevant data, incomplete data sets, or use inappropriate statistical properties. I'm not quite sure whether this categorical approach of the AI Act does convince me personally, especially concerning requirements for AI training data. So let's turn to the last legal instrument, non-discrimination law. The problems concerning AI training data here are threefold. First, we have a problem or questions of the scope of application of EU non-discrimination law, because it's rather restricted in certain ways. Second, the question arises what actually the requirements for AI training data can be under non-discrimination law. And third, there is the well-known problem of law enforcement, which I will gladly leave to the presentations in panel 3. So let us start with the first question. Is EU non-discrimination law applicable to AI training data? In Article 3 of the so-called Race Directive, we can see in a quite paradigmatic way how EU non-discrimination law is applicable to the context of employment and general contract law, which I will focus on in this presentation. So in the context of employment, the directive is applicable to any condition for access to employment. And as the Court of Justice of the European Union interprets this term quite broadly, there should be, in my opinion, no real problems with the application to AI training data, especially if we stress the word conditions for access and say that if the recruitment, in a recruitment process, an algorithmic decision-making model is used, the AI training data definitely is a condition for access. And in the context of general contract law, we could reach similar results by stressing the word access to certain goods and services. So personally, I think we will not have too much problems with the application of EU non-discrimination law. But even if non-discrimination law is applicable, we still have to answer the question which requirements exactly non-discrimination law establishes for AI training data. And here we should distinguish two scenarios. The first is some biased training data that leads to unequal outcomes unequal outcomes. And this is the paradigmatic case of AI-driven discrimination, which is already discussed in the literature and which I'm sure we will deal with in panel 2. The second case is more interesting from the perspective of this presentation. The question would be, can a certain set of data as such, meaning the compilation of a set of data, independently of the application in a certain context, be considered a case of direct or indirect discrimination? And the major problem, in my opinion, but I will leave this open for discussion, is that EU non-discrimination law requires a less favorable treatment in the case of direct discrimination, or a particular disadvantage in the case of indirect discrimination. So could we argue that the compilation of a data set as such is a less favorable treatment or a particular disadvantage? In my opinion, one could build such a claim on the theory of representational harm provided by philosopher Nancy Fraser, and we could fill these measurements with the criteria which are presented in the first step with the technical metrics of balance, representativeness, and up-to-dateness. But this too is just a thought which I developed yesterday evening while preparing this presentation, and I would gladly leave it open for discussion. So my conclusion would be threefold. First, with the AI Act and EU Non-Discrimination Law, we could have two legal instruments that tackle the problems of biased AI training data, unlike the GDPR with its limited scope, where I'm not sure whether data protection law will help us that much. Second, both instruments, and here comes the challenge, need further in-depth research to specify the exact requirements for good AI training data, which is kind of a similar conclusion that Gaetan and Félicien already draw at the end of their presentation. And the third, and here I can also agree to the other speakers, this research needs to be interdisciplinary. The legal and the computer science community should and have to work hand in hand when developing such criteria. This is really necessary for getting to tackle the problem of biased AI training data eventually. So thank you for your attention, and I hope we'll have a good discussion in the 30 minutes to come.